5 days. That is how long it had been since the surgeon cut through my muscle to reach my spine, and my husband stood in the doorway of our bedroom, arms crossed, watching me struggle to sit up against the pillows, and said it like he was reading me a weather report. This Saturday, all 12 members of my family are staying at our house for 2 weeks. Have everything ready. I still had the surgical brace strapped around my lower back. I still had the faint bruise from the Roman 4 line on my left hand. I still had the discharge paperwork folded in my nightstand and drawer right next to the bottle of oxycodone. I was trying to take as little of it as possible. And there he stood, not asking, not suggesting, not even pretending this was a conversation, informing me, the way you inform an employee that their request for time off has been denied. There are sentences in a marriage that do not bruise your skin. They bruise something deeper, the part of you that still believed you mattered to the person sleeping beside you every night. I actually laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. Then I looked at his face. He was not joking. Kyle, I said, keeping my voice, even because I had learned a long time ago that raising it never got me anywhere with him. I just had surgery. My surgeon told me I need a minimum of 4 weeks, without lifting, without standing more than 15 minutes at a stretch, without climbing stairs more than once or twice a day. Can we postpone it, even just a few days? He did not look up from his phone. No one is waiting. Just do as I say. That sentence landed somewhere I did not expect. Not in my chest where I thought her was supposed to live. It landed lower in my stomach, in the place where you feel something curdle and go cold. 22 years of marriage, and he had never spoken to me quite like that before. Not with that particular coldness, like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be considered. And that was the moment I understood something had shifted in our marriage, and I had not been told. I did not argue. I have never been a woman who argues well in the moment. I need time to turn things over, to look at them from every angle before I know what I actually think. So I just nodded, and he left the room satisfied, already texting his mother the arrival details. And I lay there in the quiet he left behind, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, feeling my back throb in that deep structural way that reminded me my body was still healing from something serious. And I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for longer than I wanted to admit. When did I become invisible in my own house? To understand what happened next, you need to understand what came before. Every summer, without fail, for 22 consecutive years, Kyle's family descended on our house, like a small cheerful army that somehow never noticed the one soldier doing all the work. His parents, George and Linda, married 50 years, with opinions about everything from how I loaded the dishwasher to how I seasoned a roast. His brother Ethan, who said more than once, usually after his 3rd beer, that this house had always felt like the family house, as if that were a compliment and not a quiet act of erasure, a way of telling me that the home my father built belonged to everyone except the woman maintaining it. Ethan's wife and their 2 teenagers, Kyle's younger sister and her husband, their toddler, who was admittedly adorable, but who also meant I spent 2 weeks cutting grapes into quarters and wiping down high chairs. 12 people, 14 days. Every single summer. I did the math once years ago, out of curiosity more than anything, and stopped when the number of hours started to feel like an accusation I was not ready to hear. I bought the groceries, a specific list, because Linda did not eat gluten and George did not eat anything spicy, and the teenagers required a constant supply of a particular brand of string cheese that was only sold at one store 20 minutes away. I made up the beds in the guest room and blew up the air mattresses for the overflow. I did the laundry mountains of the towels and sheets that smelled like other people's homes. I drove to the airport sometimes twice in a single day. I planned the meals. I cleaned the bathrooms. I smiled in photographs where I was always the one standing slightly outside the frame, the one who had just run back from the kitchen to check on something and arrived a half-second too late to be center. There's a term researchers use for this kind of work. They call it invisible labor, the thousands of small tasks that keep a household running, but never appear on any ledger, never earn any recognition, because the moment they are done well enough, they become invisible. They become expected. They become the air everyone breathes without ever wondering who opened the window. Studies show that in the average American household, women perform roughly 60% more unpaid domestic labor than their partners. But during those summer visits, my share was not 60%. It was everything. Not once in 22 years had anyone asked if I was tired. Not once had anyone asked if the timing worked for me. It had simply always worked, because I had simply always made it work the way water finds the lowest point and settles there without complaint. And like water, I had been slowly, invisibly eroding. That night, long after Kyle's breathing evened out beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, the blades catching the blue light from the street lamp outside our window. My back ached. My mind raced. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself actually think about the last 2 decades instead of just surviving through them. I thought about our daughter Chloe, away at college now, probably asleep in some dorm room 3 states over, blissfully unaware that her mother was lying in the dark doing arithmetic on her own exhaustion. I thought about the promise I had made to myself in the hospital recovery room, groggy from anesthesia, when I told myself But this surgery was going to be the thing that finally slowed me down, finally made me protect myself the way I had spent 2 decades protecting everyone else. And then instead of reaching for the pain medication on the nights, and I reached past it for my laptop. The screen threw pale light across the blanket across the brace, still cinched around my middle. I was not checking recipes. I was not building a grocery list. For the first time in my marriage, I opened the folder containing the deed to our house. My parents bought this house in 1994. I grew up in it in the room that later became my daughter's nursery, then her bedroom, then the guest room where Kyle's mother slept every summer, without ever once thanking me for the fresh sheets. When my father passed 8 years ago, and my mother followed 2 years after him, the house came to me. Not to me and Kyle. To me. I remembered signing papers at the lawyer's office, remembered Kyle sitting beside me, the day distracted checking his phone saying that his great honey without really looking up. He had never asked to see the deed. He had never needed to. In his mind from the day we moved our furniture back into my childhood home, it simply became our house. And somewhere in that quiet grammatical shift from I to or my ownership dissolved into something communal, something he felt entitled to open up to 12 relatives without asking me first. I carried my laptop and a small flashlight into the hallway bathroom at 1 a.m, locked the door, and sat on a closed toilet lid reading the deed like it was a letter my father had left me that I had forgotten to open. Every page twice. The language was plain, almost startling in its clarity. Sole owner. My name and only my name printed beneath my father's signature and the notary's seal. I sat there in that small bathroom, my knees pulled up awkwardly because bending my spine still hurt, and I realized something. This was the first time in 22 years I had locked a door in my own house to read something that belonged to me, for myself, by myself, and something inside me settled. Not anger exactly. Something steadier than anger. 30. The next morning after Kyle left for work, I called Diane Foster, the attorney who had handled my parents' estate. I told her everything. The surgery, the 12 relatives, Kyle's flat refusal to even consider postponing. She listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, letting me talk myself all the way to the point. Melissa, she said finally, let me ask you something. Whose name is on the deed? Mine, I said. Just mine. Then legally, you have full authority over who occupies that property and under what conditions. Your husband does not need to co-sign a decision about your own home. You are not asking permission. You are informing him. I sat with that for a long moment, the phone warm against my ear. I did not want to hurt him, I said, and I meant it. Whatever else was true, I had not stopped loving Kyle. I just did not know anymore if he had stopped seeing me. This is not about hurting anyone, Diane said, and her voice softened in a way that told me she had had this conversation with other women before. You had made your surgery 5 days ago. Your doctor gave you explicit restrictions. You are not obligated to host anyone's family or otherwise while you are recovering. Setting boundaries is not cruelty, Melissa. It is the bare minimum of taking care of yourself. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. I wrote it down on a sticky note and pressed it to the edge of my laptop, where I would see it every time I opened the screen. Those 6 words became the foundation of everything I did next. By Thursday, I had 3 phone calls scheduled, and I made every single one of them from the quiet of my car parked in the pharmacy lot 2 miles from the house. My seat reclined just enough to keep the pressure off my lower back. I did not want Kyle walking past and overhearing, not because I was hiding anything illegal. Diane had been very clear that everything I was about to do was well within my rights, but because I needed to finish what I was building before he had the chance to talk me out of it the way he always managed to, with that particular tone he used when he wanted something, and had decided my resistance was just a formality to be waited out. The first call was to a company called Buckeye Restoration, an interior renovation outfit that handled everything from water damage to full remodels. I told the woman on the phone, a brisk, efficient sort named Patricia, that I needed a full interior assessment and restoration quote. Flooring, paint, some drywall work in the upstairs hallway where an old water stain had never quite been addressed. All true, incidentally. I had been meaning to fix that stain for 2 years. Patricia said she could send a 3-person crew out Saturday morning first thing, and that the work would likely take 2 weeks given the scope. 2 weeks. I felt something in my chest unclench at those words. The second call went to a heating and cooling company for an emergency inspection of the central air system, which actually had been making an odd rattling noise for about a month. I was not fabricating problems. I was simply choosing for the first time in my marriage to prioritize my own home's actual needs over my own exhaustion in service of everyone else's comfort. The third call was to a painting company Diane had recommended, one she said was reliable about honoring contract terms, including the standard clause about occupancy during active work. No resident on the premises during interior painting and floor refinishing for safety and liability reasons. That clause was the whole point. I had it read back to me twice. By Friday evening, all 3 crews were confirmed for Saturday between 8 and 9 in the morning. My insurance company confirmed that under my recovery plan, I qualified for a short-term stay at a rehabilitation apartment complex about 15 minutes from the house. a place with grab bars in the bathroom, a single-level layout, and a nurse who did wellness checks twice a week. I had not mentioned this option to Kyle, because he had not asked. Not once in 5 days had he asked where I planned to actually recover. While hosting 12 people in a house with stairs I was not supposed to climb, I packed my bag Friday night, while Kyle was at his brother's house, presumably finalizing arrival logistics. I moved slowly, the brace creaking faintly with each motion, folding just enough clothes for 2 weeks. My medications, the folder with my post-surgical instructions, my laptop, and the framed photograph of my parents that had sat on our dresser for years. I held that photograph for a moment before putting it in my bag, my father's face looking back at me from behind the glass. The man who built this house, the man who left it to me. And I thought you did not leave me this house, so I could disappear inside it. I left a note on the kitchen counter, not dramatic, just factual. Gone to recovery housing per doctor's orders. House is closed for scheduled renovation work beginning Saturday. Contractors have keys. Please do not interfere with their schedule. It is a liability issue with the insurance. I drove myself to the rehab apartment Friday night, wincing every time I hit a pothole, and I slept better than I had in 5 days. I was not there to see it, but Kyle told me about it later in pieces in the weeks that followed, and I have stitched the account together from what he and eventually Linda admitted. 3 SUVs pulled into our driveway around 10 that morning, packed with suitcases, coolers, folding beach chairs, a separate cooler specifically for the seafood Ethan's wife insisted on bringing every year. 12 people spilled out onto the lawn, chattering, already discussing who would sleep where, already slipping back into the comfortable assumption that everything would be ready for them, because everything had always been ready for them, because I had always made it ready. And there, taped to the front door at eye level, were 2 printed signs laminated so they would not curl in the humidity. Home closed for renovation. No occupancy until further notice. Per contractor and insurance requirements. Behind the signs through the front windows, they could see the crew already inside. A man in coveralls sanding down the hallway floor. Plastic sheeting draped over the living room furniture. The unmistakable chemical smell of primer already seeping out through the screen door that Kyle later admitted he had tried uselessly to pry open. Kyle stood on the porch, according to Linda, for what she described as a very long time, just staring at the sign like it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. Patricia's crew foreman came to the door, polite but firm, and explained that the property was under an active service contract prohibiting occupancy during the work. Standard liability protocol. Nothing personal, sir, just company policy and the terms of the agreement. Kyle called me 4 times before I even turned my phone back on. When I finally did, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed in my rehab apartment, I watched the missed call notifications stack up on the screen one after another like something building toward a wave. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as though I sat there scheming, rubbing my hands together like some villain in a movie. That was not it at all. I felt mostly a strange and unfamiliar calm, the particular quiet of a woman who has, for the first time in 2 decades, made a decision entirely for herself, and is bracing gently for what comes next. I let the 4th call go to voicemail. I picked up on the 5th. His voice came through sharp and clipped, none of the smoothness he usually carried like a second skin. What did you do? No greeting. No how are you feeling. Just that, like an accusation dropped on the table between us. I kept my voice level. Exactly what my surgeon asked me to do, Kyle. I am recovering from major surgery. I cannot host 12 people right now. I told you that. You said no one was waiting. Well, listen, my parents are standing on the porch. Ethan's kids are asking why we cannot go inside. Do you understand what you have done? I understand. I hired a licensed contractor to do work my house has needed for 2 years, I said. I understand my insurance is covering my recovery housing. I understand I told you 5 days ago that I needed you to postpone this trip, and you told me no one was waiting. There was a silence on the line that felt longer than it probably was. Then he hung up. Linda called next. Her voice was tight with the particular fury of a woman accustomed to getting her way through sheer persistence. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? We drove 6 hours. The children are exhausted. This is completely selfish of you, Melissa. Completely. Selfish. That word. As though a woman 5 days out from spinal surgery asking not to host a house full of relatives was the height of selfishness. And not the 22 years she had spent accepting my labor, as though it were simply something that happened rather than something I did. I did not argue with her. I had learned over 2 decades that arguing with Linda was like trying to hold water in your hands. Instead, I texted her a photo of my discharge paperwork, the surgeon's restrictions printed in bold at the bottom. No lifting over 10 pounds. No standing longer than 15 minutes. Minimum 4 weeks recovery. Then I texted simply, this is why. I hope you all find comfortable arrangements. And I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and did not look at it again that day. Chloe called me the next morning and her voice was the first thing that made me smile in nearly a week. "Mom," she said, laughing into the phone, "Grandma Linda called me asking if I could talk some sense into you. I told her you just had spine surgery and she should probably talk some sense into herself." I laughed too, the first real laugh I had had in days, and something in my chest loosened at the sound of my daughter defending me without my even asking. That is the thing about raising a daughter, to know her worth. Eventually she turns around and reminds you of yours. Kyle, meanwhile, was navigating a crisis I had spent 22 summers quietly managing, without him ever noticing the machinery behind it. 12 people needed somewhere to sleep, and the local inn was fully booked because of a wedding that weekend. He ended up at the Marriott near the interstate booking rooms, at a rate that came to just under $4,000 for 2 weeks, not counting meals. He was the one figuring out at 9 at night what 12 people wanted for dinner, only to discover that George did not like the Italian place, and Linda's stomach could not handle the Mexican restaurant, and the toddler needed a specific brand of crackers that was not sold at the gas station convenience store where Kyle ended up exhausted at 10 at night. He was the one driving to the pharmacy for George's forgotten blood pressure medication, driving the teenagers to the outlet mall because they were bored, fielding a dozen small requests that used to simply resolve themselves before he even noticed them as requests, because I had always resolved them first. I was not there to see any of it, but I could picture it with unsettling clarity, because I had lived it myself for 22 summers, invisible and unthanked. By the 6th day, something in Kyle's texts started to shift. The first 2 days had been all accusation, capital letters, exclamation points. But by Wednesday the tone changed. "Long day," he texted. No punctuation, no complaint attached. Just those 2 flat words sent at 11 at night. Thursday: "Mom wants steak for dinner, but Dad says no red meat since his cholesterol appointment. Cannot win." I did not respond to either message. I was not trying to be cruel. I simply did not have an answer for him yet, and I had stopped believing it was my job to always have one. There was something almost meditative about not being the one solving it this time. I spent my days at the rehab apartment doing the exercises my physical therapist had given me. Short, careful walks down the hallway. Ice on my back in the evenings. Reading a novel I had started 8 months ago and never finished, because there was never quiet enough in my own house to hold a thought for longer than 10 minutes. On the 3rd night I lay on the narrow bed listening to the hum of the air conditioner, and I let myself feel for the first time without guilt trailing behind it something close to peace. Meanwhile I had opened the spreadsheet I had kept for 15 years. I want to explain what that spreadsheet was, because it was not born out of bitterness. Not originally. I had started it back when Chloe was in elementary school, mostly to track our household budget. Grocery costs, utility bills, the ordinary bookkeeping of a family trying to save for a daughter's college fund. But somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, I had started lauding the summer visits too. Not out of any grand plan, just the same instinct that made me keep receipts for everything else. Groceries during the 2-week visits, always noticeably higher than our normal weeks. The spike in the water and electric bills every July. The cost of the air mattresses we replaced twice, because the teenagers punctured them. The new mattress in the guest room after George's back trouble required something firmer. The rental car we covered 1 year when Ethan's transmission gave out mid-visit, and he just needed a little help getting back on his feet. The airfare we quietly paid for Linda and George 3 separate times when their retirement account, as George put it, was a little tight that year. I sat at the small kitchen table in my rehab apartment and added it all up slowly, carefully, the way you count something you have been avoiding counting for a long time. The number that appeared at the bottom of the column was $185,412. Over 22 years. I did not cry, though I thought I might. Instead, I felt something colder and clearer settle over me. The same sensation I imagine a surgeon must feel studying an X-ray before an operation. Not anger exactly, but a kind of precise and emotional clarity about the shape of the problem in front of her. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman could do is stop explaining herself and simply show the math instead. I called Kyle on what would have been the last day of the visit and asked him to gather everyone at the house that evening. The renovation crew had finished 2 days early. The floors gleamed. The hallway wall was finally free of its water stain. The air conditioning ran quiet and even for the first time in months. He agreed, sounding cautious, maybe even relieved that I was finally engaging again after 2 weeks of near silence. I arrived that evening, still moving carefully, the brace loosened slightly now that I was further into recovery, and found all 12 of them gathered in the living room, perched on furniture that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. I could see it on their faces the moment I walked in, the assumption worn openly that I had come to apologize, to explain myself, maybe to cry a little and let them comfort me back into my old role. Linda even stood up, arms half raised, as though preparing for the kind of embrace that precedes forgiveness. I did not sit down. I distributed the folders instead, one to each person, moving slowly around the room, saying nothing until everyone had one in their lap. Then I stood by the fireplace, the same spot where I had stood in 100 Christmas photos over the years, always slightly out of frame, and I let them read the cover page in silence. 22 years of hospitality, and underneath in smaller text the total, $185,412. Page by page the breakdown. 2004 through this year. Groceries itemized against our normal monthly averages. The spike in utilities every July circled in red. The replacement air mattresses. The guest room mattress. The rental car. The 3 years of airfare. Photographs I had taken over the years. Linda in the kitchen I had stocked. George asleep in the recliner I had bought specifically because his back needed the support. The receipts themselves scanned and dated. Undeniable. Linda's face changed first, then George's. Ethan flipped through the pages faster than the others, his jaw tightening, with each one landing on the photograph, the rental car, a receipt from the year, his transmission fail. Can anyone name one vacation? I said, my voice steady quieter than I expected it to come out, where I was treated like a guest instead of the maid. Nobody answered. The room had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that has weight to it that presses against your chest. Can anyone remember? I continued, asking whether I was healthy enough or rested enough, or simply willing before inviting yourselves into my home for 2 weeks at a time, every single summer, for 22 years. Still nothing. Kyle sat on the arm of the sofa staring down at his own folder, and I watched something happen in his face that I had not seen in a long time. Not defensiveness, not the reflexive loyalty to his family that I had grown so used to. Something closer to recognition. The look of a man who has just realized that the foundation he was standing on was not concrete. It was a person, and she had been holding still for a very long time. I'm not asking for the money back, I said, and I meant it. I am not interested in being repaid. I kept this because somewhere along the way I stopped being able to trust my own sense of what was fair. I needed to see it written down to believe it myself. I looked at Linda specifically because I think some part of me needed her of all of them to understand. I have loved having this family in my life. I have never once loved being invisible in my own house. George cleared his throat, like he might say something, but nothing came out. Ethan closed his folder and set it on the coffee table, his ears red. Linda sat back down slowly, the folder still open on her lap, to the photograph of herself in my kitchen. And for the first time since I had known her, she looked less like a woman preparing an argument and more like a woman confronting a mirror she had not expected to find. I did not wait for an apology that evening. I did not think one was ready yet, and I had stopped needing it to arrive on any particular schedule. I simply gathered my things, told Kyle I would see him at home once the paint smell cleared, and drove myself back to the rehab apartment for one more night. The folder of my own labor, sitting finally in someone else's hands instead of mine. I moved back into the house 11 days after I had left it, walking through rooms that smelled faintly of fresh paint, instead of the usual chaos of a family visit winding down. The hallway floor gleamed under new varnish. The air conditioning hummed evenly, no more rattling. It felt oddly like moving into a version of my own home that had been waiting for me all along, just underneath the version I had been living in for 22 years. Kyle and I did not have some big dramatic conversation that first night. That is not how real repair works, I have come to understand. Not in one sweeping speech, but in 100 small adjustments, made quietly over time. What we did have a few days later, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us, was a conversation I had been waiting half my marriage to have. I did not know it added up to that much, he said, turning his mug slowly in his hands. Not just the money, all of it. The driving, the meals, the planning. I did not know because I never had to know. You always just handled it. I know, I said, and I was not trying to make him feel worse. I was just telling the truth the way I had promised myself I would from now on, even when it was uncomfortable. I'm not going to pretend those 2 weeks were not awful, he admitted, a small tired laugh escaping him. My mother complained about hotel pillows for 4 straight days. I do not think I slept more than 5 hours a night the entire time. He looked up at me, then something more honest in his face than I had seen from him in years. But I understand now. I actually understand, Melissa. I do not think I ever really did before. We agreed that week on something we should have agreed on years earlier. No more open door policy. No more assuming the house belonged to whoever wanted it whenever they wanted it. Any future visit would require both of our agreement in advance, and would come with clear expectations. Guests would help with groceries. Guests would clean up after themselves. Guests would not treat me as staff simply because I happened to know where everything was kept. The real test came about 6 weeks later, at a smaller family dinner. Just Kyle's parents, this time invited properly, with 2 weeks' notice and an explicit conversation beforehand about what the visit would look like. George arrived stiff and formal, clearly still processing, and made a point of complimenting the renovated hallway in a tone that suggested he was trying very hard to find something safe to say. Linda, for her part, brought a casserole dish, something she had never once done in 22 years of visits. She set it on the counter with a kind of careful deliberateness, as though placing an offering at a threshold, She now understood. She could not simply walk through. Partway through dinner, Ethan called Kyle's phone. He had not been invited this time, something Kyle and I had discussed and agreed on together, and I heard Kyle's voice shift into something firmer than I was used to hearing him use with his brother. "No, Ethan, not this time. We are keeping it small. You are welcome to visit, but you will need to plan it with us in advance, same as anyone else." I looked up from the stove surprised and found Kyle watching me, checking, I think, whether he'd said the right thing. I nodded just slightly and he nodded back, and in that small exchange, the quiet call and response across the kitchen, I felt something repair itself that I had thought might be broken beyond fixing. Later that evening, after his parents left, George paused at the door and said gruffly, not quite looking at me, "House looks good." The floor. It was not an apology. It was not even close to one, but it was George Roberts acknowledging something out loud that he would have once considered beneath him to notice. A few nights later, I was in the kitchen when I overheard Kyle on the phone with his father, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Dad, I need you to understand something. This is Melissa's home. We are being precise about it. It was her home before it was ever mine. I should have remembered that years ago, and I did not. And that is on me, not her." There was a pause, George's voice rumbling on the other end, and then Kyle said simply, "I am not arguing about it anymore. That is just how it is going to be." I stood in the doorway with a dish towel in my hands, listening to my husband defend me to his father for what might have been the first time in our entire marriage, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for longer than I had realized. Months passed. Autumn came, and with it the ordinary rhythms of our life. Chloe home for a long weekend, the leaves turning along our street, my back finally fully healed, the brace long since packed away in the closet. Then one Tuesday evening, in October, my phone rang, and it was Linda. Her voice when it came was different than I had ever heard it. Smaller, almost tentative, nothing like the commanding tone I had known for 2 decades. "Melissa," she said, "I was wondering, would next Saturday be a good time to visit, just for the afternoon? I would call ahead, of course, and bring something for lunch if that is all right with you." I stood alone in my kitchen, the late afternoon light coming gold through the window over the sink. The same kitchen where I had cooked 1,000 meals for people who never noticed the hands that made them. The same window my mother used to stand at washing dishes, humming to herself. And I smiled. It was not an apology. Linda Roberts, I suspected, would never quite manage the words themselves, but it was something I had waited 22 years to hear. A woman who had once treated my home as a birthright, now asking gently, humbly, if she might be allowed to knock. "Saturday would be lovely, Linda," I said. "I will see you then." There's a truth about love that no one tells you when you are young. They tell you love is patient. They tell you love is kind, but no one tells you that love without boundaries is not love at all. It is erosion. It is a slow vanishing, so gradual. You do not notice you are disappearing until one day you reach for yourself and find only the shape of what everyone else needed you to be. If you have ever felt invisible in your own home, if you have ever given so much of yourself that people forgot to ask whether you had anything left to give, I hope this story reminded you of something important. You are allowed to stop disappearing. You are allowed to lock a door and read the deed to your own life. You are allowed to show the math, and it is never ever too late to be seen.